Hello, and welcome to the Two Real Cinema Club. I'm James Ruzicka.
I'm Andres Llorente. And today, Jimmy, I believe we're taking a look at two good films. We always like to have an old film and a new film and see if we can make some connections between the two. And this week we looked at In This World, a film by Michael Winterbottom, written by, we don't know how much he wrote, but written by Tony Gersoni from 2002, as well as Flee, a Danish animated documentary, but wonderful narrative that came out just in 2021.
So yeah, in cinemas at the moment. When we first talked about what films we were going to do this week, and we came up with the idea of doing Flee and In This World, and shortly afterwards, then it kind of Russia invaded Ukraine, and for about 15 seconds, I was patting myself on the back, thinking, "Oh, we're geniuses. We've come up with such a brilliant idea. Look, there's refugees in the news again." And after 15 seconds, I realised that I'm an idiot because there have been refugees every week of the year, every year for the last 1,000 years. There are always refugees. It's just sometimes they make it into the news cycle and sometimes they don't. But yeah, if ever there are not refugees on the news, it's because the news has got bored of them, not because they've gone away or found somewhere to live. So this year's refugee picture, Flee, originates in Denmark. Did you enjoy watching that?
I did. I loved it very much. And you should pat yourself on the back because these two films were paired quite perfectly. They both focus on Afghan refugees, I guess. Yeah. So the country of Afghanistan, where the U.S. forces just pulled out in August. So, we're 7 months beyond another tumultuous experience for the Afghan people.
Yeah.
I think this film, it pairs well with what's going on right now in Russia because the Russians appear in this film quite a bit because of the journey of the protagonist. He has to spend a considerable amount of time in Russia and getting through Russia, sent back to Russia, and then finally out for good. So I think it's definitely a very relevant film for right now. Currently nominated, I believe, for at least Oscars in Best Animation, Best Feature Film, Best Foreign Film. So it's got quite and Best Documentary. So it's a little hard to get a handle on it, but it is, I think, an entirely true story. And I guess I'll just get right into it if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So it's directed by a Danish man named Jonas Rasmussen. We just looked at it in IMDb and saw that it was produced for about $3,500,000. Currently, it hasn't made that money back, but I'm sure it will through award seasons and wherever it's going next. I saw it on Amazon Prime. You saw it in the theater, you said?
Yeah, it's got a limited cinematic release in the UK.
Okay. So it must look good. I saw it on a large television. We streamed it on Amazon Prime. It is an animated film for the most part. I guess there are a few mixes of some live action and animation. And there's this interesting little tip-off because the song, is it Take Me Home by Aha?
Oh, it's Take On Me.
Take On Me,
yes.
I'm sorry.
I remember so vividly from my childhood.
Take On Me comes in very early in this film, and it's very interesting because that, of course, is a mixture of animation and live action, and that scene sort of becomes birthed out of these period pieces of probably 1970s, 1980s Afghanistan, and the main character is running around the city.
Listening to his Walkman, isn't it?
Yeah, listening to a Walkman. So he's presumably listening to that song on the Walkman. But it was just kind of a nice nod to the fact that it's doing sort of the same thing that Aha did with Take On Me back in the 80s. Or is that 80s or is that early 90s?
It's like mid 80s. I'm going to guess 1984. That's what I put my money on.
Okay. So there is an occasional mix of historical footage following the life of Amin as the protagonist, who sort of sits down for this animated. He becomes animated in this interview with the filmmaker, and it'll feel fairly. As we talk about the two films together, they're going to feel very similar in some ways, but also hugely different in other ways. So bear with me. This one's just very much a documentary, but it feels it's just a great story. So it comes across as a narrated or narrative film at some points. He's talking with the filmmaker, and he lives in Afghanistan at a time when there's a lot of turmoil. The Soviets are sort of withdrawing when he's a young boy there, and the Mujahideen is being backed by the United States. It's a time when the Taliban are sort of moving in to take control. And Amin and his family flee. Their father has sort of disappeared because I guess he's a government official of some sort.
It's not explained at great length, is it? He's just like this sort of shadowy figure.
Yeah.
And even the animation for the scenes when he disappears, it's a beautiful effect because they are shadowy and cloudy.
Yeah.
In the same way that the memories are. It's a really nice effect. Sort of thing you can only really do with animation.
Yeah. So we do get a fair bit of his background growing up, at least to the early years. I don't think he's more than 10, but when he has to leave with his family. But he is at a point where he's crushing on Jean-Claude Van Damme, of all people. So he's sort of getting in touch with his sexuality at a pretty early age. And that does play a part a little bit in the story. We sort of meet his partner in Copenhagen when he's an adult. These interviews that are really based the film on take place, I think, when he's probably in his mid-30s or something. So he has a partner, and they're buying a house in present day. But in his life story, the family ends up in Moscow, where they're really treated badly. I mean, the Russian police just do not look good in this film at all. They're taking bribes, they're beating people up, they are raping and pillaging, and I believe it all, but certainly it does not make Russia look like a very friendly place for refugees.
It's truly dismal, doesn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah. They get trafficked. The idea is that they've got an older brother who's going to bring, or try to bring, the mother, and then Amin has an older brother and then two older sisters. And the sisters actually get sort of trafficked to Sweden quite a bit earlier. So they're sort of raising money bit by bit. The brother's just working a cleaning job, it looks like, in Sweden. So he's saving up money and then trying to get them to Sweden to live with him and get them out of Moscow. And one thing that's really similar between these two films is a lot of the nighttime stuff and the crossing of borders. They sort of switch in this film, from an animated, a clear sort of animated images sequence to these dark sequences where it's mostly shadow and you can see the snow on the ground. In both films, people have to travel through snow and cold at night. And both films really handle this similarly but really effectively. Sisters eventually get onto a container ship. We'll hear more about container ships throughout. And they make it to Sweden, even though some people that are in that container with them either die or are definitely in very bad condition when they finally get there. And in Moscow, the other brother and Amin and their mother, they're kind of just pent up in their apartment. They really can't get out. They're basically prisoners in Moscow in their own apartment. And if they do go out, they get treated very poorly by Russian police or Russians. So it's a pretty dismal life in Moscow. But the sisters do go out, so that sort of gives them some hope. And basically the next move is just try and get either the next person out of Moscow, and it happens to be Amin. So we start following his story, but much of his story is not telling his story. So that's a wonderful little piece there, is that this other narrative has been given to them. They're not to talk about any family. They're sort of just to sort of get out of the country each one at a time without, having any connection to other family members. So he's basically sort of going out there as an orphan.
And this kind of becomes like a self-fulfilling lie, doesn't it? Because he has to pretend to be an orphan in order to escape the country and avoid being sent back. But he has to keep the lie up, so he effectively turns himself into an orphan.
That's right.
So it's about the way that being a refugee is so isolating that the only way you can live your life is by deliberately isolating yourself even more. It's like a vicious circle.
Yeah.
It's a great little bit of storytelling, actually. It's one of those less seen aspects of the refugee struggle.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it is. It's really storytelling. So it's not just film storytelling. He's actually sort of storytelling his life in the sense that he's got something that's not true that he has to convince others when he's crossing borders, and convince himself that story is true, is the one that he's actually not. There's a nice touch that Kaspar, which is Amin's partner in Denmark, he wants to buy a house and settle down, and it's sort of played against this having no house and not even being able to go outside in Moscow. So a nice little balancing act there, and it sort of gets some of the present-day story. And Amin is actually an academic now. He studied at Princeton. He's going to do his doctorate, I think. at Princeton. So he's a little wary of settling down, even though he loves Casper and he wants to get a house, but he's a little nervous about it. So it kind of gets that, you get the trauma and the damage that he's experienced, so that you see even settling down or just kind of being in one place again could be traumatic after being stuffed into an apartment in Moscow and not being able to get out. So a lot of this story is about his trauma and not being able to tell these things until he actually goes on film, or his animated self goes on film to tell them.
And even then, like, he remains kind of anonymous, doesn't he? So it's like it's pseudonymous. He doesn't give away his full name. He doesn't really reveal what he's studying or what he does. Yeah. So even though he's had a feature film based on his life, he still can't really reveal the truth, publicly. There's a lovely scene right towards the end of the film. Armin and Casper, they buy a house, and they make a joke about how are you going to carry him over the threshold, and instead Casper carries a cactus over the threshold, and he kind of shrugs and he says, well, it's the cactus is so similar to you that I don't see there's much of a difference. And again, it's a cute joke, but it kind of emphasizes how being brought up in this climate of fear and this atmosphere of being unable to reveal yourself or being unable to share, it pervades every aspect of your life. So it's a cute little moment that's actually really telling. It's a great bit of storytelling again.
It is nice, yeah. And that, I love the animation of that, because it actually looks like it is their real house, of course, and it's sort of, they go to the actual filmed footage of the house eventually after they've disappeared into the garden, so that the anonymity is really preserved. But you do realize, okay, that is what their house that they end up buying together does look like. It's actually the same location. There's another harrowing boat experience. This time it's with his older brother and his mother. So they try to make a crossing. The Estonians take them in, sort of intercept the boat, and they sort of have to live in this prisoner camp, it almost seems like, in Estonia before they get sent back to Moscow again. Yeah. They're given a choice to return to Afghanistan, but they elect to stay in Russia, where things are really bad. And my next note is just that the Russians really suck in this film. It's mostly the Russian police again, but he witnesses what is about to become a rape of another girl who's been obtained by the police when Amin and his brother are sort of pulled off the street and beat up a little bit and thrown into a police van. So it just really shows you how crappy life was there for refugees at that time, and at any time probably, but... So that's when they really decide, okay, we're going to send one at a time, and Amin's going to be the next one, and he gets smuggled again, but this time by truck. He gets into Denmark, and that's when he tells his fake story, and it's wonderful because the story has become so real to him, and it's so intense that he starts crying. So, of course, the Danish immigration think, oh, this is definitely true. We've got to let this guy in and help him. So it's a great piece where what's true actually is unmentioned, and what's fake actually becomes the truth. It's a nice little twist. And then as the film winds down, he's in Denmark and he wants to confront his sexuality, and he wants some sort of medicine to make him ungay, sort of change his ways somehow. But to his surprise, even though he's gone to see a doctor to get some sort of medicine, I think she really deflects it. And suggests that he sort of accept himself first, and then he's really surprised when his Swedish family, which is the same people from Afghan, but they're in Sweden, and they not only support him, but they sort of knew he was gay from a very young age, without bringing it up in Afghanistan, where I think it would have brought more shame. Now it's really just the children of the family in Sweden. It's a new generation. It's a new place, and the older brother actually delivers him to a hoppin' nightclub and gives him money to spend. So he finally finds his freedom of sexuality and being able to express himself. And I think from there, obviously, it doesn't go into the story that happens in the United States, but he gets to the U.S. at some point and studies there. And then at the end, Casper and Amin have that beautiful house that we were talking about and describing before. But he still has very limited contact with his family. I think that's sort of an end note in the credits. It's that they're still living this lie, and he, until recently, had been really living that lie until the filmmaker, who was maybe a friend from high school, filmmaker invites him to do this project, and now the truth's finally coming out. And you sense that he's just doing so much better, and I think the film plays it that he's already gone back to Denmark permanently. He didn't have to stay in the United States too long to study, and everything's sort of finally coming together. But again, he might have a little sense of unease going into a place where he's going to be staying for a long time, because it would probably remind him of Moscow, where he was stuck in an apartment. But in Denmark, they make it very clear that there's a garden right there. You can see there's a river or a bay nearby, so you can see it's going to be a much better experience. And that's more or less where the film ends.
They maximize the use of this kind of theme of barriers, don't they? Because it's all about either crossing the barriers to leave the country, or getting past passport control to enter the country. But then also the way that sort of living in fear for so many years has also created barriers just between people.
Yeah.
And then because of confronting his sexuality, has this kind of barrier within himself as well, as if he's unable to cross the barrier between the self that he wants to project and the self that he feels that he is and the person he feels he should be. It's all about the way that this kind of living in fear creates barriers in every perspective. They really sort of tie that together very nicely through the film.
I agree with you, and I think both films, they're both young boys, probably roughly the same age.
They probably are. Yeah,
and you just really get a sense of how, and they're sort of a generation apart, though, really. Because I think early 80s, and is it Jamal, and the other film is probably early 2000s. So, they're sort of generation removed from one another.
20
but
years
the trauma, but you can just see that trauma staying with them forever. And it's so... Both films are difficult to watch in some ways, but they just feel so heavy. You really feel the trauma that both these guys are experiencing.
The way you describe it doesn't sound like a fun night out. But actually, at the end of the film, I did feel kind of uplifted.
Oh, yeah.
So it does take you through this emotional journey, and it doesn't grind you beneath the heel of its boot for the whole duration. I think you do feel some redemption, and there is joy at the end. In the same way there's joy at the beginning. It starts with this Aha song, and then it finishes with Daft Punk, doesn't it? In the gay club.
That's right.
So you kind of feel there are all these kind of joyful moments.
Yeah.
It is possible to snatch happiness from sadness.
Yeah.
My question to you is: do you feel that this film benefits from being an animated film, or is it actually just a little bit of overlaid frippery, and the story could have been told just the same, in a different medium?
I think it could have been. I think it was a good choice to go animated, because it sort of preserves the anonymity that he needs there, and for the exact reason that I think if it had been a live action thing, it would have felt far more traumatic to the viewer. I think that some of those moments of joy come out of, you're not really looking at the ugliness of it. You're looking at images or pictures or drawings, really, of the ugliness of it. And I loved the animation. I thought it was beautiful. I don't know if I would characterize it. It's like quasi-anime or something like that. It has a really nice look. It reminds me of the old Speed Racer that I used to watch as a kid. But it's lovely, and they use wonderful techniques in the sense that I really like the night scenes, and the escape scenes are always sort of darker, murkier. They almost become black and white in the animation.
Yeah, sketchy, isn't it? Yeah,
it's sketchy, and the tone is just fantastic throughout. So I think it was probably a good choice to do it in animation. It's a good question, though. What was your opinion on that?
It does have a real anime feel, actually. You're right, not least because it's very low frame rate animation, isn't it? It's never faster than I'd think than about 12 frames per second. Often it's less. It's like 8 or 6 frames per second. It's kind of very jerky. It's and in part that's a budgetary constraint.
Yeah.
If you slow the frame rate, then you only need to draw half the number of pictures.
That's right. Yeah.
But also it gives this quite sort of I hesitate to call it painterly, but it's a proper kind of sketchy feel. A little bit like the difference between like the earlier, very fluid Disney films and those kind of 1970s Disney films like The Aristocrats, if you ever watched that,
yes.
or Robin Hood, where it was very sketchy and you could see the scribbles on the screen. And somehow that offers another layer of either fantasy or distance, or it allows you to enjoy the drawingness of it, to give yourself a little bit of emotional space.
There's an interesting bit of self-awareness about it, though, as well, because you see the microphone that he's talking to, you see some of the lighting or the camera. So I mean, they're very obviously telling you that this is a documentary, or this is really as two guys sitting down and talking. And I assume that the audio they're using is of Amin. That's probably not his name, but it's his voice, I imagine. So they don't have to use some sort of weird, voice alternator in order to disguise him or put him in shadows. So you get to see him, and you're right. There's some points where he's just lying on a table, not moving, for seconds and seconds, and you're thinking, well, that's because he probably didn't move in the interview, and maybe they're saving some money on animation by using that one shot for 12 seconds.
This
instead
is
of
probably something we'll talk about when we come on to
movement as well.
Onto in this world, because that film is skirting this boundary between being a documentary and being a reenactment or being a drama. And it feels to me a little bit like there is a conceit in Flea that we are meant to feel that these are the original interview tapes and that someone has drawn an animation over the top to make it feel like you're illustrating, a proper audio documentary. And I'm wondering whether maybe that's not the case. And actually, certainly looking at the credits, quite a lot of the characters are played by actors.
Yeah.
It's keeping both its feet on either side of that boundary between documentary and just a straight drama. And that's something that this animation will let you do. It will muddy that boundary. It's interesting to see an animated film aimed at adults. This is one of the things that I kind of reflected on having seen this, because I have children who are 12 and 14 now, and so I've spent the last dozen years watching a lot of animated films, and I think we're living in an absolute golden age of animated cinema. Quite different to the cinema that the animated films that were available when I was a boy. When I was kind of young, animated films for adults didn't really exist at all. I think there was Heavy Metal in the 1980s, which I never saw, but this is a real rarity. Whereas these days it's possible and it's feasible to create an animated film aimed specifically at an adult audience. I don't think anyone would feel comfortable taking children to this film. It's definitely aimed at an adult audience, and it's nice to see the golden age of animation spread the reach of animation into drama and documentary and tackling some of these really big issues. And kind of do things here that you could only really do with animation. I think this film would be poorer if it were just restaged with actors, or even if it was just like a radio interview. I think the animation brings in this extra aspect, which makes it something more than it would have been without. Yeah. I thought it was terrific, actually. Moving, clever, very memorable, well worth it, and quite tight for time as well, isn't it? It's only about an hour and a half. It's it's a nice, tight film that achieves all it wants to achieve and then gets out.
Yeah. No, it's great. It was great. And I like your point about being for adults, because it seems like the really monster hits that are animated now are written for both the children and the adults who are paying for the children and escorting them into the theater. So the subtext in a lot of the films, the animated films, currently seem to be I don't know. They work on a couple different levels anyway. So it definitely is something for everyone.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. That's Flea. So this year's Danish Animation Award nominee. After the break, we'll come back and we'll talk about In This World from 2002.
So we are back, and Jimmy's going to talk us a little bit through In This World 2002, which is a Michael Winterbottom film. But it was written by Tony Grissoni, who visited Jimmy and our group at London Film School. So Jimmy and I studied screenwriting together at London Film School in the 2000 aughts. Is that what you call them? 2000
yeah, mid 2000s, wasn't it? 2006.
Yeah. 2006, 2007. And Tony Grissoni came in and did a pretty nice sit-down with us where I think there were 12 of us, and we would occasionally get writers to come through. And Tony came through one time, and I'm wondering what you remember about that, because I don't remember a lot, but he did say one thing that really caught me off guard. So
embarrassing. I'll tell you what I do remember about Tony Grissoni, which is I don't think I can remember very much about what he said, except I do remember him emphasising that there was very little difference between documentary and drama filmmaking.
Yeah.
And he was saying basically the same things. The thing I do vividly remember about Tony DiCristone is how well dressed he was.
He looked great.
I can remember his $700 overcoat that he was wearing. I can still picture that overcoat now. Nice shirt, beautiful coat, such a lovely coat. I mean, lovely coat meaning that he never took it off all the time that he was at the film school. Yeah. And I think we saw him not just once. I think he came at like 2 or 3 times. I feel like we saw him a few times.
He was
always with that coat.
Sure,
never took the coat off.
Yeah.
Beautifully dressed man.
Yeah,
clever guy, great writer. I'm not sure what else what do you remember? What do you remember?
I remember that he told us that he just sort of starts writing a script and writes and writes and writes. Like, he doesn't outline stuff. He didn't do any like background stuff on characters, doing little character biographies. And I was skeptical about all that stuff. But I always plan things out, and I really, break it into act structure, which I'll talk about a little bit on this film. But he just said he starts writing and writes and writes, and that just seems so odd to me. I don't think he's going to go down as one of the absolute greatest screenwriters or anything of the sort, but I was surprised that a successful screenwriter could really just sit down and write without structure or any kind of formula in his head, or maybe not even having the whole story sorted out. That was the thing that struck me, but it worked for him. I think if you could just write unhindered, maybe you get a lot of great writing out, whereas the rest of us are held back by our own little, our own borders and our own expectations of ourselves.
Maybe it's just sheer mass effect, is it? Was Tony Grisoni writing 700 pages, and out of those, 80 would be good. So just keep typing. Yeah. So that is the antithesis of what they taught us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that happened more often than I expected. So here we are, we're paying good money, we're sitting there writing away, and we're getting all this advice, but you inevitably get the absolute opposite advice from some of the professionals who would come through.
Tony Grisoni would turn up and tell us, kids, you're wasting your money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
there's the door.
Some of them were that close to saying as much, but I think this film would have been a couple years behind him because it's 2002. So I know we talked about it, and then I thought I saw this film. I did not remember it when I watched it recently. So maybe I did not see it, or maybe I saw just parts of it. But I think one question is like, how much did he write for this film? And I think maybe as you explain it a little bit, or tell us about it, we can hash that out too. Because I'm not sure how much. Again, if it's a man who just sits down with no idea and starts writing, maybe he did write the whole thing. But I'm curious to know, like, was there a screenplay, or was he just sort of writing things as they went along? Because it seems like it's a journey film. So it feels like maybe a lot of it was quasi-improvised with Tony writing some things down, or unless he went in beforehand with everything. So I'll let you take it away. Yeah. So
it's one of those things where I suspect we will never know, and everybody concerned will have their own version of what really happened. So in this world, it's a kind of docudrama. I think that's what you would call it. I think it has its roots in sort of Italian neorealistic cinema. It's using non-professional actors who are kind of playing characters who are almost themselves. And it's talking about the story of 2 Afghan refugees who live in a camp in Pakistan. They've been displaced by the US bombing of Afghanistan, which started, I think, in October 2001. The film was shot in 2001, released in 2002. And these 2 boys, Jamal and Inayat, want a better life. They are effectively what the UK government refers to as economic migrants. So they're not necessarily running away from a war right now. No one is blowing up their homes at the start of the movie, but they are displaced and they're looking for a better life than the one they've got in this camp in Pakistan, where Jamal works in a brick factory making $1 a day, something like that. So these 2 lads, Jamal is probably 12 and Inayat might be 20, I think. Mm-hmm. That's kind of about the ages. Neither of them, certainly Jamal doesn't have any family, I think. He has like sort of uncles or cousins, but no close family. But they manage to scrape some money together, and then they embark on this long, twisting journey across the Middle East and across Europe, trying to find a better life. So originally they go to Iran. They're picked up and returned back to Pakistan. They try again. They bribe a policeman by giving him a Walkman. They make it to Tehran. and from there, they return back to Pakistan, I think, and then they return to Tehran, and they hide in an orange truck surrounded by boxes of oranges. Then they cross from Tehran to Turkey in the middle of the night. They get some work briefly in some kind of weird, unregulated cutlery factory before hiding in a shipping container.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what they were making there. I thought it was screws or bolts. You think it was...
I wonder whether it was like forks or knives. It looked like some incredibly dangerous machinery where you poke your hand in the machine. And,
and it was noisy, too.
Something is made. Oh, it was terrifying. It was like one of the more terrifying scenes in the film. They make it to Italy, but most of the people who hide in the shipping container are killed, and it turns out that Jamal is the only one who makes it, and Inayat is killed on the journey. He sells flags in Italy and steals bags, gets enough money for a train ticket to Paris. Then he makes it to Sangatte, which is a refugee camp very famous in the British media for a while. It was really it was like the British right-wing press's shorthand for hell on earth, where refugees were waiting to enter the UK. They eventually smuggle their way onto the underside of a truck, an articulated lorry, and make it through the Channel Tunnel into London. And pretty much the last scene in the movie, Jamal phones his uncle back in Pakistan and explains that he's made it to London, so the uncle should pay the traffickers their fee, but Inayat he died on the way. The way he phrases it, he says Inayat is not in this world, which is where the title of the film comes from. And for all the horror and the terror of the journey, the last images of the movie are of refugees who are back in the Peshawar, Pakistan refugee camp, and they kind of seem to be having a nicer life than any of the moments that Jamal has enjoyed over the last sort of 18 months. Basically, it's a long 90-minute story about waiting, hiding, being sent back, retracing your steps, being ripped off at every opportunity, constantly fearing for your life, and then having a fairly uncertain reward at the end of it. So it certainly gives you a visceral take on the challenges of being a refugee, traveling illegally, doing all the best you can to try and make yourself a better life. It partners up very well with Flea because it's set in the same part of the world, and it's a very similar journey. And we see some of the same events happen to the extent that they almost start to feel a little bit like tropes. That we see the shipping container. We see the chaotic street scenes. We see people having their money taken and being ripped off, and the kind of the shady people traffickers. And in this case, I believe many of the people involved are kind of acting as themselves. So, the policeman who's bribed by being given a Walkman apparently was, a real border policeman. He was just performing for the cameras, doing the sorts of things that he normally does in his everyday life. So it also straddles this kind of border between documentary and drama and, reality and fantasy. You do have to ask yourself, so vividly realistic does it appear? How much was Tony Grisoni writing? The dialogue feels extremely authentic. Jamal is this very believable sort of early teenage 12, 13, 14-year-old boy. He makes these kind of stupid jokes, these kind of really crazy, silly jokes, which really reminded me of the kind of silly jokes that my son makes, actually. They just felt so authentic. He really feels like a real person.
And he speaks quite a bit of English in the film as well. Almost like he was even learning it as they went along. And it's always hard to judge acting when it's done in a language that I just absolutely do not understand. But it didn't feel like acting. It felt very authentic in the sense that it was non-actors doing it, but it could. I see it coming off as kind of amateur just because I'm not sure how well they delivered the lines, and a lot of their movements and their non-verbal acting didn't seem to be there. But the life experience was there, I guess, and I think that comes across. These are who they are. They're not delivering lines that they wouldn't normally deliver anyway, and they're not doing, sitting around drinking tea and eating a lot, and they're not doing things that they're not used to doing. So it felt natural in that way, I guess, but I'm sure not, polished acting.
It shares a lot of recurring themes that we've seen in Flea. I've made a little note here, made a little list on my sheet here about like the absent father, absent family, absent kind of men, the loss of family, this constantly kind of being ripped off and kept in the dark. And also even the idea of the way that music is used, that music is really important in Flea, and just the use of this Walkman, and Amen's ability to separate himself off from the world with music.
Yeah.
And then the Walkman is Jamal's prized possession as well. We get this kind of diegetic music in this world. It feels like the music in the film is the music that we would be hearing on the radio in the truck, or in the cafe when they're waiting to be picked up. It feels like the music is absolutely part of the scene. It's not something laid over the top.
And some of it might have been just nat sound and natural music, what they hear.
Absolutely, if it's not, it's absolutely what it feels like.
Yeah.
The way that Jamal has to sacrifice his Walkman quite early on in the film in order for him to make it past this checkpoint, it really feels like he's giving away. It's like his right arm or his soul. Even Inayat, who travels with him, is kind of upset that he gave away the Walkman. Yeah, it's like
very upset.
It's exactly. It's a real. It's heart-wrenching to see this kind of the one physical thing that he prizes so much has to be given up. Talking about the neo-realist heritage of the film, are you an admirer of those films? Did you like those kind of those Rossellini films and Ruzicka and those kind of Italian sort of this Italian social realist films with non-professional actors? Was that something that ever appealed to you or not?
Not a whole lot, honestly. I just love really tight storytelling, and I like scripts. I mean, I write them, so anything that is like strays from that, I feel a little uncertain. And this one I did too, for sure. It took me a while to get into this. I mean, I was watching a terrible version of it on YouTube. It wasn't formatted properly. The sound was bad, but that might have been good because the sound probably wasn't good to begin with.
The way this film was shot, actually, it's because it was all made with like low light handheld camcorders. So I watched the same copy that you did, which is very hard to find now. This film, it's not available on the streaming services. No. There is a free copy on YouTube, and it is a crummy quality copy, but I bet the original is not much better. It's interesting that if the film were made now, even the cheapest mobile phone, the cheapest cell phone now, will film 4K video, and the picture quality would be immensely different.
And that's just 20 years ago, That's
absolutely. It really sort of grounds this film in its in the era in which it was made. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted though.
No, that's right. Well, it was made for £75,000. This film was inspirational to me because it's so guerrilla style. It just proves that you can go out and make a film. So I really love that. And Winterbottom has done some similar stuff. I think he's a director who's definitely done some higher budget things, but he's also made a pretty good name for himself just doing things not unlike this, where he's just doing something completely unorthodox. And so at first I was really uneasy watching it, but I eventually really got into it. I was impressed with just how it drew me in. And it's funny because a lot of it is you're just in one truck and into the next, and then you're driving one direction, you're driving the other. A lot of the shots are just trucks crossing desert scenes or in the mountains. So it sort of brought up this postulate from Hitchcock, where you have to get the boring bits out. Like, film is like real life, but the boring bits edited out. The boring bits are in this film, but they're actually kind of exciting because there's so much struggle and there's so much hardship that these characters have to go through. So that, I mean, just 2 or 3 seconds of a truck just going on a road is actually a little bit of a respite from how difficult their journey is. So all that stuff is in there. And another thing that really struck me was the role of B-roll. I shouldn't say it that way. The importance of B-roll in this film. Like, a lot of it is just stuff that they were shooting in order to, I think, cover the fact that they were not they were not scenes where they would rehearse. They would move the camera and record one person's dialogue and then flip it over. So there are all these little coverage shots that are just B-roll of, if two guys are talking in a cafe, they'll look at whoever's serving something at the counter for a moment,
yep.
just to cover it, just to make it seem like, okay, there are no gaps. When there were probably lots of gaps. I mean, I could imagine Tony Grisoni feeding someone one line through an interpreter, and then they'd have to say that line, and then they'd cut it quickly, and then Winterbottom's getting footage all over the place to just sort of piece together a narrative. So it's really a B-roll masterpiece of sorts. I mean, he's just very clever in the way that he gets the B-roll in there, and it becomes part of the film in a way that establishing shots and whatnot really don't normally have that prominent a place in a film.
I mean, it feels like it was shot with one camera, doesn't it? It doesn't feel like there were like two or three people and a guy with a boom mic. It doesn't feel like that. Maybe it was, but it really feels like it's just one guy with a camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I've certainly written a refugee script. You've written a refugee script, haven't you? Because I've read it, actually. You did a script about people trafficking. I remember reading that.
Yeah. I've only got the short now, and there's a container. There's a container ship scene in there. So, as much as those things, as you said, they sort of become the canon or the tropes, I think that stuff happens. And the interesting thing about it is that
absolutely.
It happens a lot more than we want to acknowledge. And because it's so clandestine to begin with, it happens a lot. We just don't see it. So, and even if we saw it, we wouldn't want to see it. So I think, as much as it might be a trope, it's reality, and that scene in this world where and everyone's shouting each other's names out, and they're just suffocating, and it's awful, and the noise is again, the sound is bad, and I think that works really well. And then it comes back. There's a scene when he's on a train. I think he's on a train in England, in London, or I forget what it was. But he starts hearing those sounds again. He hears everyone suffocating it again. It's just, the effect is tremendous. So yeah, my script had that in there as well. It's Chinese immigrants in London. So the short has been written, but it's an excerpt of a number of intersecting stories. So they're compelling stories because they feel undertold. Also just that amount of struggle just makes it an automatic in terms of a protagonist facing adversity.
What's the little statistic that the narrator reads out at the beginning of In This World? That something like there are 14 million refugees. This is, at the time of shooting, there were 14 million refugees, it's thought, in the world, and about 1 million of them were getting trafficked a year. Yeah, which is an enormous. There's a huge human cost to what is essentially an industry built up from the failing of international government. Yeah. And I don't know what it looks like in the US. Certainly in the UK, we're seeing a similar failing of government at the moment, where many countries in Europe are offering to take in Ukrainian refugees, and the British government are kind of folding their arms and saying, well, if you've got the right paperwork, maybe you'll need to go to the embassy and get some forms filled in now that the embassy has been blown up. It's this is a lesson which was not learned in the 1980s, was not learned in 2002, and turns out not to have been learned in 2022 either. Hand in hand with there never being a week where there were no refugees in the past, it looks like we're going to have no weeks where there are no refugees for the foreseeable future as well. It kind of makes you despair, doesn't it?
It does, and I think what we're seeing a lot more is also climate refugees are starting to.
Yeah, that's going to get bigger and bigger, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think we're in for more of it. Sadly. And then I think one effective thing here in this world was the BBC style narration, which kind of begins the film, and it's heavier in the early parts to tell us that story. That's how we learn it, is from like a news reporter narrating the story. It gets it going, and then the map movements actually are quite helpful. They sort of have these little pictures of them going across the world and showing us the countries. That was actually quite helpful. First, I thought this was a little hokey, but no, it was good. It was necessary.
It was slightly too Indiana Jones for my liking, but it was but it's fine, and it's kind of necessary. And I don't think I will be confident to draw a map of this journey. And I feel like I know a bit of European and Asian geography, so it's nice to have somebody just draw the lines on a map.
Yeah. So I might take us back a little bit towards my first question about Grisoni and what he wrote, and also mention like both he and Michael Winterbottom. It's almost like they're doing nothing, but on the other hand, I think they do a whole lot with this film. I think they're working with almost nothing to a certain extent. no sets, very little gear, presumably a minimal story. So there's this beautiful just sort of effortlessness about it. It seems like they're not really doing a whole lot to direct people or to write for them, but they do just enough where it is an effective film.
Yeah.
And then another, I guess the other big thought that came to me was it ultimately gets forced a little bit into three-act structure, and I thought like that's kind of a real stroke of genius, because it wasn't that hard, but because I think I had a hard time watching the first 20 or 30 minutes because I felt very unstructured. But eventually it sort of just falls into this sort of first act. They just have to get out of they get into Iran, and they get turned around a couple times. And so I think, that's sort of and there's actually even a refusal of the call early on. I think, who's going to make this trip. I think Inayat was definitely going to make the trip, but someone else was going to go, and then Jamal really can't go, but then Jamal gets called to action. So it ends up following a lot of the structures that eventually, even loosely, really help it. And then I think the middle act is certainly about getting through Iran eventually, and then into Italy, and then you get the sort of quick. A lot of things happen when he's alone. So it even follows the end of Act 2, the death of in the container ship. Something has to die at the end of Act 2, and that definitely happened. And then he has to go on his own in the end through, as you said, Italy, France, and then into England. And he ends up as it's crazy because he does, is being a dishwasher all alone in London that much better than life in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
There's a sliver of hope there, but it's a good resolution. It's not a happy ending per se, but it's a happier than most of the journey. So it just showed me the strength of three-act structure, even if it's not like classically done or anything like that. There definitely is a little bit of structure to the film, and I think it saves it ultimately.
And it shows you the power of that story shape, that it can meld the form of the film without being in your face. It's like and it's only afterwards you realise that it feels organic, that somehow it's settled into those shapes. But you can bet it wasn't organic, and they had to do a bit of hammering and chiseling to make it fit into that shape. I guess that will probably be what Grisoni did, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's very interesting. One little bit of trivia: I did read that for the scenes that they filmed in Sangatte, that the local authorities wouldn't let them film there, and in fact that's all been filmed in the UK with a mock-up French refugee camp that they had to build. Which is funny because it seems utterly authentic, doesn't it?
It didn't seem any less authentic than the rest of the film, so kudos to them. That's great. So
it's clever, isn't it? I think once you're in that groove of believing what you see, and I think the cinematography does quite a bit of the work. There a little bit. It's like a post Blair Witch film, isn't it? It's that once you see a little bit of shaky cam, a little bit of grainy video, that's become so vividly the shorthand for this is reality. That then we're prepared to accept anything filmed that way as if it was reality. It is sacrilege to mention this film in the same discussion as In This World. But if you remember Signs, the Mel Gibson film from 20 years ago?
I didn't see it. I do remember.
It's a slightly dicey, not particularly great alien invasion film. But there's this little sequence about halfway through the film of a news report with some shaky handheld camcorder footage, and that's by far the most convincing and frightening moment of the film, simply because it enjoys this grammar of reality. And in this case, in This World, that cheap aesthetic and the low budget camcorder filming technique paid off in spades. It means that once you're settled into that groove, you believe everything that happens on screen, whether it was real or not. And certainly in spirit, everything that happens in this film is real. If it didn't happen exactly this way to exactly these people, it's happened similarly to millions of others.
Totally believable. So the Blair Witch Craft Project was good for something.
Good for camcorder sales, yes, which went through the roof. So these two films effectively are the same story, told in quite similar ways, with a few notable differences. But this is an eternal story, and I suspect in 20 years' time we'll still be getting these refugee pictures.
Podcasters will still be making money off of this stuff.
Makes you despair for humanity, doesn't it? Great. Well, this has been fun. I've enjoyed both of these films. I enjoy going back to see In This World. And Flea is a film that I would recommend anybody listening to try and see on the big screen if you can, or stream it at home. But yeah, it's tight and eye-opening and very well executed.
Yeah,
and they're both good pictures, both well worth tracking down.
Yeah,
this has been fun as always. This has been the Two Reel Cinema Club. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.
That sounds great. Looking forward to it. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.